Block Island, Rhode Island, October 1949. On the wind-scoured sheep range overlooking the Atlantic, Salvatore Trapani was doing something that made no sense. His home, a surplus military Quonset hut, was already an object of local curiosity, a metal tube dropped among the saltbox houses and shingled capes. But what he was doing now tipped curiosity into open mockery. He was building a tent over his house. Not just any tent. This was a colossal thing, a 40-foot expanse of heavy, tar-blackened Navy spec canvas. He had sunk thick timber posts into the ground, creating a bow frame that stood a good 18 inches off the Quonset's corrugated steel skin. With a system of ropes and pulleys that looked more suited to a three-masted schooner than a house, he was slowly, methodically, stretching the immense canvas over this frame. "What in God's name is the Sicilian sailor up to now?" muttered Silas Croft, leaning on a fence post 100 yards away. His neighbor, Jebediah Hayes, spat a stream of tobacco juice. Lost his mind is what? A tent. On Block Island. Come the first nor'easter, that thing'll be halfway to Portugal. The island's county building inspector, Hadley Pierpont, had driven out specifically to see the monstrosity for himself. He stood by his Ford, arms crossed, a look of grim certainty on his face. He saw a man violating every principle of sound construction he'd ever known. A flammable, temporary material stretched over a permanent dwelling. It was foolish. Worse, it was a liability. He watched Trapani cinch a rope tight, the canvas groaning as it took the tension. Pierpont shook his head. The man was crazy. What did this Italian-American Navy quartermaster, this man who'd spent years rigging tents in the Pacific, understand about the physics of air and wind that the seasoned builders of New England had missed entirely? I'm going to tell you that story. It's a story about ingenuity, about the quiet confidence of hidden knowledge, and about how one man's strange idea redefined survival on a frozen island. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand the profound power of a simple pocket of still air. If you appreciate stories of practical genius triumphing over conventional wisdom, take a moment to subscribe and hit the like button. And tell me in the comments, what's the most unconventional solution you've ever seen work? Salvatore Trapani was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer, nor was he a Block Island fisherman who knew the moods of the sound. He was a rigger. For 20 years, his hands had known the language of hemp rope, the heft of a brass grommet, the precise tension needed to keep a canvas field hospital from collapsing in a typhoon. His world had been the quartermaster corps of the United States Navy, a universe of hull plates, steel cable, paraffin wax, and vast sheets of tarred canvas. He thought in terms of sheer stress, wind load, and water resistance, not in board feet and stud spacing. When he and his wife Maria brought their two small children, Marco and Sophia, to Block Island after the war, they were seeking peace. Sal had seen enough of the world from the deck of a ship. He used his savings to buy a small plot of land and a surplus Quonset hut, the cheapest shelter available to a veteran with a young family. It was meant to be a temporary home, a foothold. That first winter, 1948, was the crucible that forged his strange invention. The Quonset hut, a naked steel shell on a concrete slab, was not a home. It was a cold trap. The Atlantic wind, relentless and wet, scoured every inch of the curved metal, pulling the heat out faster than their wood stove could produce it. Condensation rained down from the ceiling, soaking their bedding, their clothes, their spirits. They lived in a perpetual, shivering dampness. Maria, a woman of quiet strength, did her best to make it a home. She hung blankets from wires to create rooms, but the cold seeped through everything. Sal remembered waking one January morning to find the coffee can they'd left on the back step held not leftover grounds, but a solid brown stone of ice. In the bathroom, the tin of cold cream Maria used for her chapped hands had split its seams, the white cream frozen solid and expanded. Most heartbreaking for Sal was seeing the little red wagon he'd bought for Marco. Left outside for a single night, the brutal cold had contracted the metal frame so severely that the red paint had cracked and flaked off the handle, littering the frozen ground like dead leaves. They spent that winter huddled around the stove, wearing their coats indoors. The children were always coughing. Sal burned through cords of wood at an alarming rate, yet the hut was never truly warm. At night, he'd lie awake, listening to the wind howl over the steel arch, feeling the cold radiate from the walls just inches from his head. This wasn't living, it was enduring. He knew he had failed his family. But as he lay there, his mind drifted away from the frozen Rhode Island coast and back to the hot, humid islands of the Pacific. He remembered the vast canvas awnings they would rig over the steel decks of supply ships, creating shade. He remembered how, even under the tropical sun, the air between the hot steel and the canvas sheet was surprisingly cool and still. He remembered rigging tents for admirals, double-walled affairs where the outer fly took the beating from the rain and wind, leaving the inner tent placid and dry. The problem, he began to realize, wasn't just the cold. The problem was the wind. And he knew all about defeating the wind with canvas. The conventional failure of Block Island homes, and especially the Quonset hut, was a lesson in basic thermodynamics. The island's traditional builders understood insulation in one primary way: mass. A thick stone foundation, heavy timber walls, plaster, and lath. These were all attempts to slow the transfer of heat through conduction. But on an island raked by constant high-velocity, moisture-laden wind, the bigger enemy was convection. Wind is a heat thief. Every cubic foot of cold air that blows across a surface strips away a layer of warmth. A standard log cabin or a shingled salt box house had countless tiny gaps, around window frames, in the eaves, through the mortar, where the wind could penetrate. Even without direct infiltration, the wind's relentless passage over the outer walls dramatically accelerated heat loss. The still layer of air that naturally clings to a surface, providing a small but crucial insulating buffer, was simply stripped away by the 40-mile-per-hour gales. Families like the Fenwicks, in their handsome but drafty colonial, burned through a winter's supply of wood by February and were forced to close off half their house to survive. But if a traditional home was inefficient, Sal's Quonset hut was a thermal disaster. Corrugated steel has an R value of nearly 0. It conducts heat almost as well as it conducts electricity. Without any insulation, the thin metal shell was essentially at the same temperature as the outside air. The wood stove inside was fighting a losing battle, trying to heat the entire Atlantic seaboard. The intense convective cooling caused by the wind hitting the curved metal surface was so extreme that it created a phenomenon known as cold wall radiation. Even if the air inside the hut was heated to 50 degrees, a person sitting near the wall would feel chilled to the bone, as their own body heat radiated towards the freezing cold metal surface. This was the core of the problem Sal faced. His neighbor's mockery came from a place of experience. They knew a thin metal hut was uninhabitable in a Block Island winter. Their solution would have been to build a real house of wood and stone. Pierpont the inspector saw the hut as a failed experiment, a piece of mainland folly. When Sal began his strange construction, Pierpont saw only a man making a bad situation worse, adding a flimsy, flammable appendage to a structure that was already fundamentally flawed. The mockery lasted through the late autumn. The validation would last for the next 50 years. Sal's work began not with a hammer, but with a shovel and a post-hole digger. He sourced 10 thick, pressure-treated timber posts, each 12 feet long. He spent a week digging, measuring, and setting these posts in concrete 5 on each side of the Quonset hut. They were positioned precisely 2 feet out from the concrete slab, forming a larger arc that mirrored the shape of the hut itself. He then bolted curved wooden ribs, bows he had painstakingly steamed and bent himself, to the tops of these posts, creating a skeletal frame that stood a consistent 18 inches away from the metal skin of the Quonset. This was the part that drew the most confused stares. "Building a fence around his house?" one fisherman asked another at the general store. "Looks more like a trellis for a giant beanstalk." Next came the canvas. It was not ordinary canvas. It was surplus Navy Spec No. 4 cotton duck, weighing nearly 2 pounds per square yard, and it had been heavily treated with tar and paraffin, making it waterproof, mildew-resistant, and almost black. It arrived in a massive, dense roll that took 4 men to unload from the ferry truck. Sal spent days on his hands and knees in the grass, stitching 2 20-foot-wide sections together with a heavy waxed sailmaker's thread, using a palm and needle just as he had in the Navy. The final product was a single, monolithic sheet of canvas, 40 feet wide and 50 feet long. Hoisting it was the masterstroke of a rigger. Using a gin pole and a block and tackle system rigged to the top of his new wooden frame, he single-handedly winched the massive tarp up and over the hut. The process took an entire day of slow, methodical work. He wasn't just draping it, he was engineering it. He attached the canvas to the wooden bow frame with a complex network of ropes fed through heavy brass grommets he had punched into the canvas hem. Each rope could be individually tensioned. It was during this phase that Hadley Pierpont made his official visit. He pulled up in his Ford, clipboard in hand, and walked stiffly toward the strange structure. "Mr. Trapani," he began, his voice carrying the full weight of county authority. Sal, perched on a ladder adjusting a line, simply nodded. "I'm afraid I can't let this stand," Pierpont said, gesturing at the half-finished canvas shell. "This constitutes a temporary structure attached to a permanent dwelling. The Island Fire Code, Section 4, Paragraph B, expressly forbids the use of untreated fabric enclosures for habitation. This is a fire hazard." Sal paused, wiping a bit of tar from his hand onto his trousers. He looked at the heavy, treated canvas, then at Pierpont. "It's treated Navy Spec," he said quietly. Pierpont was not moved. "That's as may be, but it's still canvas. It's a tent. You're putting a tent over your house. The board will never approve it. I'm issuing you a formal notice. This structure must be removed by April 1st of next year, or you will face significant fines." He made a neat, decisive note on his clipboard. Sal looked at Pierpont, then at the sky, where gray clouds were gathering. Winter was coming. He simply said, "Okay," and turned back to his rope. He had a job to finish. The final detail was a drip rail. Along the bottom edge of the canvas, about a foot from the ground, he attached a canted wooden board. Any rain or melting snow that ran down the canvas would be directed away from the foundation of the hut, preventing ice buildup at the base. By the time he was done, the Quonset hut had disappeared. In its place stood a taut, black, organic-looking shape like the shell of some giant beetle. It looked solid, seamless, and utterly alien. Pierpont drove away, convinced he was dealing with a stubborn fool. He had no idea he had just witnessed the construction of the warmest home on Block Island. To understand why Salvatore's strange tent worked so brilliantly, you have to understand the invisible architecture of air. The genius of his system wasn't in the canvas itself, but in the space between the canvas and the steel. He had created an 18-inch sleeve of what engineers call dead air. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, through direct contact; convection, through the movement of fluids like air or water; and radiation, through electromagnetic waves. Sal's design attacked all 3. The problem with his uninsulated Quonset was that the wind, a powerful convective force, was in direct contact with the highly conductive steel shell. First, the physics of the dead air gap. A thick, still layer of air is a remarkably effective insulator. While a single inch of air has an R value of about R1, the insulating property doesn't scale linearly. The optimal thickness for an air gap as insulation is between about 3/4 of an inch and 4 inches. Beyond that, the air inside the gap can begin to form its own convection currents, which reduces its effectiveness. Sal's 18-inch gap was much larger, but it worked for a different reason. The sheer volume of trapped air acted as a massive thermal buffer. A calculation shows the 18-inch air gap provided an R value of at least R3.5. Second, the role of the outer canvas shell. The tarred canvas itself had a minimal R value, perhaps R1 at best, but its true purpose was to defeat the wind. By tensioning the canvas on an external frame, Sal lifted the wind completely off the metal skin of his home. The 60-mile-per-hour gales now battered a surface that was 18 inches away from the living space. The wind could howl and rage, but the air inside the gap remained almost perfectly still. This single move eliminated the primary cause of heat loss: forced convection. Finally, let's look at the complete thermal envelope. The bare Quonset hut had an R value of around R2, generous for corrugated steel, and the thin layer of interior paint and frost. This was thermally transparent. Sal's new system combined the R values of its components. The outer canvas, R1, plus the massive dead air sleeve, R3.5, plus the original Quonset shell, R2, created a total system with an R value of R6.5. This was more than triple the insulating value of the original hut, and on par with some of the less well-built conventional homes on the island. But even this number doesn't capture the whole picture. The system's true elegance was in how it managed radiation. The cold steel of the inner Quonset wall would still try to radiate heat away from the occupants. But instead of radiating into the infinite cold of the sky, it was now radiating towards the inner surface of the canvas, which was itself warmed by the trapped air. The entire system created a stable, intermediate temperature zone. Sal hadn't just put a blanket on his house. He had given his house a thick, windproof coat that held its own body heat. That winter, the Atlantic decided to test Sal's creation with a fury. In late January, a monster nor'easter formed off the Carolinas and roared up the coast. For 4 consecutive days, Block Island was hammered by sustained 60-mile-per-hour winds blowing directly on shore. The temperature plummeted to 22 degrees, a figure that didn't even account for the wind chill, which was cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in minutes. The air was filled with sea spray, which froze instantly on contact with any surface. Every tree branch, every fence post, every telephone wire facing the sea was glazed in a 2-inch thick coating of ghostly green ice. The island was paralyzed. The ferries stopped running. The power lines, heavy with ice, snapped. For most islanders, it was a nightmare. In the Fenwick house, the family huddled in the kitchen, the only room they could keep above freezing, stuffing towels into the window sashes. The pipes in their north-facing walls froze and burst. Jebediah Hayes found 3 of his sheep frozen solid in the field, standing up as if they were merely sleeping. The island became a landscape of brittle, crystalline misery. Inside the Trapani's black, canvas-shrouded Quonset, it was another world. The wind howled and shrieked against the outer tarp, a sound Sal knew well from his time at sea. The canvas drummed and thrummed under the assault, but it held. Inside the 18-inch gap, the air was calm. Inside the Quonset hut itself, it was almost silent. The relentless, soul-leeching cold that had defined their first winter was gone. Sal kept the wood stove running at a lazy, consistent pace, using less than half the wood he had burned the previous year. The temperature inside the hut held steady at a comfortable 65 degrees. There was no condensation dripping from the ceiling. The walls were cool to the touch, but not freezing. They were not radiating cold. The true victory was in the small details of domestic life. Maria was able to do laundry and hang it to dry inside, and it was dry by morning. The children, Marco and Sophia, played on the wooden floor in their sweaters, not their winter coats, their breath not turning to vapor in the air. The most telling proof sat on a small shelf in their makeshift kitchen. It was a bowl of Maria's caponata, a Sicilian dish of eggplant, celery, and olives in a sweet and sour sauce, rich with olive oil. In any other house on Block Island that week, the olive oil in that dish would have congealed and turned cloudy, if not frozen solid. The Dodges, their nearest neighbors, had a bottle of expensive olive oil on their sideboard, split its glass bottle when the contents froze and expanded. But in the Trapani home, the caponata remained soft, fragrant, and spreadable. The oil glistened, ready for a piece of bread. This small, mundane fact was the ultimate testament. The cold had been so thoroughly defeated that even the delicate chemistry of food was unaltered. They were not just surviving, they were living. On the third day of the storm, Hadley Pierpont was forced to make his inspection rounds. It was his duty to check on the elderly and isolated residents, a task he took with grim seriousness. His Ford sedan, ill-suited for the conditions, struggled on the roads, which were now sheets of treacherous, uneven ice. Near the Trapani property, his rear wheels lost their grip on a patch of green-glazed asphalt. The car slid sideways into a shallow ditch, the engine stalling with a cough. Pierpont got out into the maelstrom. The wind hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. The cold was shocking, an immediate, searing pain on any exposed skin. He tried the ignition again and again. The engine turned over weakly, the battery drained by the extreme cold. He knew he was in real trouble. He was a mile from the nearest house he could count on for shelter, except for the black monstrosity in the field beside him. Cursing his luck, he trudged through the knee-deep snow towards Sal's hut. He had no intention of asking for help from the stubborn fool who ignored his orders. He just needed a moment's shelter from the wind to try and think. He hunched down on the leeward side of the structure, pressing his back against the base, right by the wooden drip rail. He braced himself for the biting cold he expected to radiate from a metal building, and then he felt it. It was not a blast of heat. It was a gentle, pervasive, and utterly astonishing warmth. Through the thick wool of his winter coat, he could feel a steady, low-grade heat radiating from the black canvas. It was like standing near a sleeping animal. He put a bare hand up to the canvas, expecting it to be stiff and frozen like everything else on the island. Instead, the tarred surface was supple and undeniably, miraculously, warm. Not hot, but holding a temperature far above freezing. He pressed his palm flat against it. The sensation was so contrary to every law of nature he understood that for a moment he thought he was delirious. The wind howled over his head, but in the small pocket where he stood, shielded by the curve of the canvas, the air was still and the cold was blunted. He stood there for a full minute, just feeling the impossible warmth seep through his frozen glove. In that moment, Hadley Pierpont's entire understanding of the world shifted. His confidence, built on a lifetime of conventional building wisdom, shattered against the undeniable truth his own hand was telling him. This wasn't a fire hazard. This wasn't foolishness. This was genius. He straightened up and walked to the door, his face a mask of awe and disbelief. He knocked. The door opened, and Salvatore Trapani stood there, wearing only a flannel shirt. Behind him, Pierpont could see the warm, lamp-lit interior. He saw a child's drawing taped to the wall. He smelled coffee. The blast of warm, dry air that washed over him was like stepping into a different season. "My car," Pierpont began, his voice hoarse. "I know," Sal said simply. "Come in. Maria will make you coffee." Pierpont stepped inside, stamping the snow from his boots. He took off his hat, his mind reeling as he absorbed the scene. The quiet, the warmth, the sheer normalcy of it all felt more miraculous than a burning bush. He looked at Sal, the quiet man he had dismissed as a fool. He saw the bowl of caponata on the shelf, its olive oil gleaming. He looked at the simple, effective wood stove, burning with a low, gentle flame. He finally understood. Sal hadn't fought the winter. He had simply stepped out of its way. He turned to the former Navy rigger, his expression stripped of all authority, leaving only pure, unadulterated respect. "Mr. Trapani," he said, his voice quiet, "you didn't build a house? You caught the summer inside a sail?" Sal just nodded and went to get him a cup of coffee. When the nor'easter finally blew itself out, Hadley Pierpont did not write a fine. Instead, he drove to the VFW, the DHW Post 9 Hall in town, found the editor of the Post's small newsletter, and told him a story. He was no longer a skeptic, he was an evangelist. He described the warmth radiating from the canvas in a 22-degree blizzard. He described the physics as best he could, using Sal's quiet explanations. He called it the Trapani sleeve. The story ran in the spring 1950 edition of the VFW Post 9 Guardian. It was a simple, mimeographed newsletter, but for the community of veterans living in post-war surplus housing, it was gospel. The article, titled "A Navy Rigger's Answer to the Nor'easter," included a simple, hand-drawn diagram by Pierpont himself, showing the bow frame, the 18-inch gap, and the tensioning system. The idea spread like wildfire. That summer, 4 other veterans living in Quonset huts, 2 on the mainland in Rhode Island and 2 more across the Sound in Connecticut, followed Sal's design. They sourced their own surplus canvas, built their own frames, and wrapped their metal homes in a second skin. The following winter, their letters back to the VFW Post told the same story: slashed fuel costs, warm interiors, and an end to the damp misery of condensation. Salvatore Trapani's quiet innovation, born of a miserable winter and a memory of the Pacific, had become a new regional vernacular. The principle Salvatore Trapani applied on that windswept hill was decades ahead of its time. He had, with timber and canvas, created a rudimentary version of what modern architects call a double-skin facade, or a rain screen system. These advanced building envelopes are used on skyscrapers and high-tech buildings today to improve thermal performance and manage wind loads. They work on the exact same principle. An outer skin takes the brunt of the weather, creating a thermally stable, buffered air cavity that protects the inner building. Sal discovered it not through computer modeling, but through practical experience and a deep, intuitive understanding of materials. The story of the Trapani sleeve is a powerful reminder that the most elegant solutions are often not about brute force, but about clever redirection. Sal didn't try to build a thicker, stronger wall to fight the cold. He didn't sheath the metal against the winter. He gave the Quonset a coat that held its own air. He understood that the enemy wasn't the cold itself, but the wind that carried it. By defeating the wind, he tamed the cold. His innovation was a lesson in working with nature, not against it, recognizing that sometimes the most powerful tool is not a thicker barrier, but an intelligent space. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found it valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of forgotten ingenuity. Let us know in the comments what you think of Sal's solution. The information presented in this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only, based on historically inspired events and reconstructions. The characters and specific events depicted are fictional, though the technical principles are based on real historical practices. Any application of these or similar techniques in a modern context should be done in consultation with qualified professionals and in accordance with all current building codes, safety guidelines, and regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.